Today, our nation commemorates the 16th anniversary of the terrorist attacks that took the lives of thousands of innocent Americans. We all join in solemn remembrance of the victims, and our hearts go out to their families. September 11th is a fitting date for the Senate to begin consideration of the Defense Authorization Bill. The anniversary of those horrific terrorist attacks should serve as a reminder of the reason why brave young Americans are currently deployed around the world fighting on behalf of freedom. I urge my colleagues to keep in mind the meaning of this day throughout the consideration of this important legislation, which will provide our men and women in uniform the resources, equipment, and support that they need to keep our nation safe. I'd like to extend my appreciation to the Majority Leader for his willingness to move expeditiously to the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018 and for his leadership. I'd also like to thank Armed Services Committee Ranking Member, the Senator from Rhode Island, for his hard work on the NDAA. I remain appreciative of the thoughtfulness and bipartisan spirit with which he approaches national security issues. The fact is, the NDAA is a piece of legislation in which this body and members on both sides of the aisle can and should take enormous pride. Not only does this legislation provide our men and women in uniform with the resources they need and deserve, it's a product of an open and bipartisan process that represents the best of the U.S. Senate. The Senate Armed Services Committee passed the FY18 NDAA unanimously by a vote of 27-0. I repeat, the Defense Authorization Bill was passed by a unanimous vote of 27-0. That means all 14 Republicans members and the 13 Democratic members of the committee voted in favor of this legislation. During the markup, the committee considered and adopted 277 amendments that were offered by both Republicans and Democrats. And now we hope to consider the legislation on the floor under an open amendment process that will allow all senators to have their voices heard. This process, which is exactly how legislation is supposed to make its way through the Senate, has become disappointingly rare. For too long, partisanship and politics have triumphed over principle and policy. This legislation is an opportunity for us to reverse that trend and restore regular order in the United States Senate. The need for this legislation is self-apparent to anyone paying attention to today's world. Global terrorist networks, including great power competition with Russia and China, malign Iranian influence spreading across the Middle East, a North Korean dictator racing to acquire missiles that can hit the United States with nuclear weapons. The threats to our national security have not been more complex or daunting than at any time in the past 7 decades. And we must also remember that we are a nation at war with brave young men and women deployed in Afghanistan, Iraq, and around the world. The NDAA is a legislation that will deliver to our armed forces the resources, equipment, and training they need to meet the increasingly complex challenges of today's world. And it will begin the process of rebuilding our military after years of devastating defense cuts. Now, let me point out what happens as a result of these mindless defense cuts, which every military leader has described as devastating to our ability to defend this nation. Let me just remind you the hard truth. The state of our military is eroding. We saw disturbing evidence of this reality over the summer as 42 service members tragically perished in accidents during routine, I emphasize routine, training operations. On June 17th, 7 sailors were killed when the USS Fitzgerald collided with a container ship off the coast of Japan. On July 10th, a Marine KC-130 crash in Mississippi killed all 16 troops on board. On August 21st, 10 sailors perished when the USS McCAIN collided with a tanker near Singapore. On August 25th, An Army Black Hawk helicopter went missing during a training mission off the coast of Yemen, and one soldier died. Just last week in Nevada, 2 Air Force A-10 aircraft crashed into each other. Thank God the pilots were safely ejected, but the planes were lost at a cost of over $100 million. For the 2 Pacific Fleet naval collisions, ship repairs are estimated to cost more than $500 million. The lives lost in each of these incidents were priceless. Over the past 3 years, a total of 185 men and women in uniform have been killed in non-combat accidents. During the same time, 44 service members were killed in combat. The bottom line is, we're killing more of our own people in training than our enemies are in combat. And that did not happen by accident. It is a problem caused by this mindless sequestration and a lack, frankly, of appreciation of members of this body and the other one of what the needs of the men and women who are serving in. It's about time we started listening to our military leadership, who are saying, if we don't change what we're doing in the next 5 years, our enemies will catch up. Our adversaries will catch up with us. This legislation authorizes a base defense budget that, together with the administration's request of $8 billion for other defense activities, supports a total defense budget of $640 billion in funding for the Department of Defense and the national security programs of the Department of Energy. The legislation also authorizes $60 billion for overseas contingency operations. In total, the NDAA supports a national defense top line of $700 billion. This funding is critical to begin addressing the readiness shortfall and modernization crisis caused by the self-inflicted wounds of the Budget Control Act, known as sequestration, and repeated continuing resolutions. We need to look no forward than recent headlines, as I mentioned, of fatal accidents during routine training operations for evidence of the deteriorated state of our military. These ship collisions and aviation accidents are taking the lives of our service members at an alarming rate. In fact, in the last 3 years, we've killed 4 times as many of our own soldiers in peacetime training operations than our enemies have in combat. While there's plenty of responsibility to go around, we cannot ignore Congress's role. Years of budget cuts have forced our military to try to do too much with too little. Meanwhile, our adversaries are investing heavily in their own militaries and developing future warfare capabilities intended to erode our military advantage. Simply put, we cannot wait any longer to recapitalize our forces and restore our capabilities. Another important aspect of the NDAA is it builds on the reforms this Congress has passed in recent years by continuing important efforts to reorganize the Department of Defense, spur innovation in defense technology, and improve defense acquisition and business operations. The NDAA seeks to strengthen accountability and streamline the process of getting our warfighters what they need to succeed. At the same time, it prioritizes accountability from the department and demands the best use of every taxpayer dollar. The NDAA will also improve the quality of life for our men and women in uniform and those who support them. The legislation authorizes a 2.1% pay raise for our troops. It improves military family readiness and supports the civilians and contractors who work together with our armed forces to achieve the mission. Finally, the NDAA provides necessary assistance for our allies and partners around the world who are dedicated to advancing the cause of freedom, deterring the aggression of our adversaries, and defeating the scourge of terrorism. These are the reasons why this legislation is more vital than ever. Congress's most important constitutional responsibility is providing for the common defense. The consideration of the National Defense Authorization Act each year is one of the ways that we live up to that duty.